Bless you for that. I'll remind you of this one day. You won't believe me.
If you love listening to this show, please consider giving a rating and a review on Amazon Alexa or wherever you listen. We want to continue bringing you this amazing content, and part of our ability to do that means that we need a big audience. Now, it may not seem like much, but rating and reviewing the show will help more people find us, just like how you found this show. Simply on any podcast platform, search for a show, scroll down to the bottom, and push 5 stars. It's that easy. Thanks for supporting the show. Today, I'm joined by Evanna Hugh, who is the CEO of Omelas and the Nonresident Senior Fellow at the Atlantic Council. Thanks for joining today.
Thank you for having me.
So, Evanna, you're an expert when it comes to messaging and propaganda of countering violent extremism and counter-extremism. First, can you talk a little bit about how you got into this field? And for those that are not familiar with this area of domain that you're specialized in, if you could just kind of elaborate a little bit more.
Sure, be happy to. I got into this space right out of college. I actually started out in international development, wanting to be an aid worker, but very much at the intersection of how can we use technology to drive social impact. And I got stationed in Kandahar, Afghanistan. And while I was there, I started to realize that to a certain extent, and there will be people who will just disagree with me on this, but I didn't really see a huge impact that I was having when people were way too afraid to leave their homes because of security reasons. And so I switched over to national security to first make sure that there is that stability on the ground before we can do the poverty alleviation and the other impact types of projects. So CVE, countering violent extremism, or if you can call it PVE if you're in the UK and the EU, it's basically just how do we actually prevent people from going and joining these violent extremist groups? Because we are in the US, we are protected by the First Amendment, so we're definitely allowed to have these extremist views and attitudes, and we can talk about them as long as they do not spill over into some kind of violent act, such as the January 6th storming of the Capitol. And I study specifically the messaging aspect of recruitment and propaganda. So basically trying to get these people to join.
Amazing. I think, for our listeners, because I think we tend to be more North American focused for the most part, with some branching to Western Europe. If you could talk a little bit about some of the recruitment methods of both from a domestic terrorism, but also international terrorism as well. How do they recruit, and why is the internet such a potentially a very dangerous field for people, and people have to be very cognizant of what they're reading and seeing?
A huge part of it is because in the US, we're a democracy, and so we're allowed to have these views. And so there's plenty of content online. It's just that in the past 10 years, I will argue that instead of this, the type of content that's being used to incite violence and making sure that people actually join and stay with these groups, instead of being on the fringes, they have slowly shifted more and more towards the mainstream. The election of Donald Trump did embolden a lot of those groups behind such content. But in terms of the tactics, it's pretty straightforward whether or not you're a terrorist group or you're just another actor that's trying to get a bunch of followers, right? You start on the surface web on your major social media platforms. You might have a website that's hosted by Cloudflare or GoDaddy or all of these domain sites, and you basically say, this is what I stand for. There's also a lot of the active recruitment, so going onto Facebook and looking people up by keywords and going on Twitter and going through the hashtags to see, oh yeah, that person might be vulnerable to the type of messaging or attitude or worldviews that I espouse because of X, Y, and Z. And once they do that and they hook someone on, then they move them into encrypted chats or dark web. And that's where, we start to lose track of what they're saying and all of that stuff.
Now, I think the way you laid it out seems fairly straightforward, but I think there's a lot of dimensions that makes it highly complex. And certainly, when you take into account the role of social media and their algorithmic moderation, for instance, which kind of is this notion of being in your own echo chamber, that also has a lot of issues as well. And then certainly over the last 4+ years, we've seen how social media and other even media outlets have not actually verified certain information and really continue to allow for certain misinformation, disinformation, and certainly a lot of just outright false narratives to go out there, and people not understanding that it's false, just take it for granted and that it's accurate. So can you talk about the complexities of what's happening?
Yeah, sure. And I apologize for the silence in the background. So the complexity really comes because a lot of these, a lot more controversial or inflammatory or entertaining content is there. I mean, they're typically, they can get the most eyeballs and engagements. So the way that the social media companies do their ranking is essentially based on the number of views and the number of interactions, right? And so those just tend to get upped onto newsfeed. As this was before a lot of the social media companies decided that they actually needed to do something about this type of content. But to a certain extent, it's very hard to combat conspiracy theories because conspiracy theories typically have a grain of truth in them, right? And so it's all sort of about the manipulation. But once you get people into their own echo chambers, it is also extremely hard to reach across echo chambers to even say, hey, actually, this is not true, right? The debunking aspect of it. There was a study that was done on, I believe, the 2014 presidential election in France, or the 2016, I don't remember which one, but they basically said, in about only in 4% of cases that the debunking aspect content actually reached the target audience of the people who actually believe and are taking in the conspiracy theories or fake news.
So I guess it would be really helpful to understand kind of both from a content creation and those behind it from an architecture, and those that are actually listening and absorbing this information in terms of kind of the psychology, how are they rationalizing this information? How is it that they can decipher, again, recognizing that some misinformation has some elements of truth, but let's say QAnon as an example. Mm-hmm. I mean, you have to be really, kind of not quite rational and not grounded in kind of the basic facts to think that any of that dimension of QAnon, as an example, could have some validity to it.
You may also like our quarterly Astro Perkins event that brings some of the most notable experts and category-leading startups in their area of sustainability and human survival on Earth and in space. To register, visit astroperkins.com/events.
I don't know if I will agree with that statement, actually. I think some of the people that we have seen, whether they're the really hardcore Q followers or the really hardcore ISIS believers, that they are actually quite rational. And I think they're super rational to the fact that they can rationalize away violence as a way to get to their mean, because they genuinely believe that we need this caliphate and that everybody else is bad, or the fact that the election was indeed stolen. I think they just believe it so much that it's hard to actually kind of even use their logic against them. I don't think these people are uneducated. I think if you look at the storming of the Capitol, a lot of the participants are highly educated. They're CEOs of tech companies, right? They are former military. high-ranking, right, officers as well. So it's not so much about the intelligence, but it's by how they perceive the world and their personal grievances that I think make certain people become more vulnerable to these attitudes. And so if you're from Michigan and you had a college degree and you might even have a master's, and so you think that you're set up for life. In the meantime, you have politicians where you see politicians on TV who no longer look like you because they're Muslim or they're Black or they're whoever, talking about how they need things for other minority groups. And in the meantime, you had just lost your job, the job that you have been promised that you would get, and that prestige that you get from having a job, right, in the community just taken away from you. And then at the same time, you're hearing these crazy stories coming out of DC about how there's a deep state. And, we kind of joke about like, yeah, there has always been some kind of like under like the backroom dealings and diplomacy and all these things that like they 100% happen in Washington, DC. But you take someone who doesn't know the DC scene really well, but then they're looking at all the things that they have just lost. And at the same time, they're looking at a bunch of people who don't look like them, who are, foreigners in this country, thriving and prospering. And that's going to set them off on a different path. And that's, those are people who are vulnerable to be a QAnon follower.
So, I think, one of the theories that I learned at University of Chicago is this notion of, rationally irrational. So it is this notion that, again, I think we may be kind of using terms a little bit interchangeably, and probably the wrong definition is that one can be rational, but it's irrational in the scheme of things, right? Because they're rational from the perspective of their core values and belief system. So if, for example, if they believe that human species was seeded by some foreign aliens, for example, and they, to the core, believe that's the truth, then everything else is going to kind of surround around that foundational set of principles, right? So from their point of view, they're rational. But I guess really, I think there's a number of other things that's happening. And it's so complex because you have social media, you have echo chamber, you have media that's trying to exploit and take advantage of this. I know once Trump exited, for example, Fox and many other kind of right-wing types of, media saw their numbers drop, and they tried to figure out how do they actually create new types of sensational, embellished sensational media again, so that they can drive up advertising dollars again. So I guess the question is, we have some real issues. One of those issues, I wonder that I don't know if maybe Harvard and some of the other researchers have started to kind of bring out some articles around it, is this notion of tipping point. Certainly, again, I think we're talking about the context of North America for the most part, but we're also seeing some of that overseas in Europe as well in terms of this globalization. But specific to the US, we're just a couple of 2 to 3 decades away before the whites no longer become the majority. And that tipping point psychologically, I think, is really, I wonder, is one of the biggest causes of what we're seeing in terms of, the national.
Within the national security space, there has been a lot more emphasis on demographics and the role that plays in domestic stability, but also in terms of competing with China and looking at, the demographics of the EU. And COVID has exacerbated a lot of that because the birth rates just have, plummeted in the past year and a half. But that definitely plays a role domestically. But I think a part of it too is by looking at sort of the wealth and just having more minorities represented in mainstream media and things like that could also just be a signal to the whites that like, hey, they're taking more and more of this away. And I 100% do not agree with the, we can't increase the size of the pie kind of a mentality, and that is a zero-sum game. I don't think that's necessarily true, but I think a lot of people do think that it is true. So if we start to see an increase in the representation of minorities in the media, in politics, in whatever, I think people have this automatic assumption of that, well, then that means that the white people are getting less, right? And that might not even necessarily be true. I don't know the stats behind it, so I'm not going to say one way or another, but it could just be a more of a perception issue rather than like the real hard stats and numbers behind it.
Okay. So I want to switch the conversation a little bit to, because you mentioned COVID and the last kind of 1 year of lockdown. And I wonder how that has exacerbated some of these kind of underlying symptoms and issues and has led to not only, hate crimes towards African Americans or Asians and Asian Pacific Islanders. But I wonder how those parties or groups are using different tools to even further use it to their leverage?
That's a great question. I don't think we have any stats or official reports on that, but it has been a really big concern in the past year that will be that that polarization and a lot of the social issues that COVID has brought up. So I think COVID has done really two things in terms of showing the divisions that we have within our society, right? One is that a lot of things got swept under the rug because people were traveling, were having fun, they were living their own lives. So a lot of the stuff we just didn't really pay attention to. And when all the shutdowns were implemented, I think people didn't really have much choice except to think about these things and being a lot more introspective. So that's the first thing. And second is that COVID and the way that COVID disinformation and then also anti-COVID vax disinformation have shown this polarity in terms of like who actually has access to vaccines, who can afford to be an essential worker or a non-essential worker, right? And so it has also just like brought this like great, instead of being the great equalizer that I think some people were hoping that COVID was going to be, it actually just demonstrated even the fact that if you don't have the luxury of staying at home and that you have to go to work to make that 10-hour minimum wage, that's something that I think people are starting to actually see, and that's not even talking about the fact that there are more women that are leaving the workforce because schools are not open and childcares are not open, and so how are these women going to get back into the workforce in a couple of years? And when they do, are they going to be treated as equally as the men are in terms of salary and all of these things?
Yeah. So, I mean, clearly a lot of issues to unpack, but I think coming back to our focus for today in terms of conversation, let's go back to your startup, which is called Omelas.
Yep.
And I wonder how your company is addressing some of the issues that we're talking about. But again, many of your customers, I believe, are more on the DoD's government agency side, right?
Yeah. So at Omelas, what we're doing is we're really trying to provide the most comprehensive online information environment, which is basically DC jargon and national security jargon for, we want to understand how a specific narrative move from, it could be, an adversarial actor, right, who's putting out this content. How does that actually move into the mainstream? So a very good case around the US election, for example, for one of our clients, is looking at a lot of the fake news spread by Russia, right? How does something like that originating from RT or Sputnik go to the mainstream, like Fox News, right? And once they actually get to Fox News, is that messaging actually resonating with the American audience? So a good example is the term color revolution. So this was a term that was coined by Putin when we were seeing uprisings in Ukraine and all these places, and they were called the color revolutions because they were named after the colors. And he basically said color revolutions are, and they're created by the Americans. Look what Hillary Clinton said about the Ukrainian uprising in Kyiv. And so that particular keyword is very Russia specific. And yet we started to see that term pop up on far-right forums. And then a month later, it was all over Fox News. Right? And the storming and the protesters for the storming of the Capitol actually used that term to justify why they did it. And they said there was a color revolution in DC that stole the election away from Donald Trump because they work with the deep state. And so what we need to do is we need to actually take back the Capitol and beat back these color revolutions. And you're like, wonder how a very derogatory term framed by, Putin to justify him going into Crimea and and invading, the eastern part of Ukraine to a domestic uprising 7 years later. And so our company essentially gives you the answer to that.
So this is fascinating, and it's amazing. I have a bit of a commentary and a follow-up question. Commentary, I suppose, is, I think in the past, and Russia's really part of their, offensive for decades, really, since the Cold War, has been very much around disinformation, misinformation. And it's been very much a kind of a factory type of an approach. And so it's been incredibly effective. But I wonder more recently if some of, we're certainly being influenced as the example that you just gave. But I wonder if some of these state actors have less influence in our domestic policies and rhetoric, because there's so much, disinformation that's originating from the homeland. From the U.S. So that's kind of a commentary. The follow-up question that I have is really around this notion of syndication. So one of the concerns that we've been seeing is certainly Russia has been doing that for some time, but China appears to be aggregating kind of regional and local smaller newspaper or media properties around the world. Whether it's in parts of Africa, whether it's in parts of South America, and other kind of remote regions, and collectively, these small parts become something fairly large and dominant, and they're trying to create this, massive global voice that's trying to influence and sway opinion, as well to seed disinformation. And any thoughts about that?
Don't forget to visit astroperkins.com to register for our next quarterly events. Past and current speakers include Julianne Hough, actress, dancer, and winner of Dancing with the Stars; Damian Vaughn, former NFL player; Neil Gregory, Chief Thought Leadership Officer at the IFC World Bank, and many more. To register, visit astroperkins.com and click on Events.
Syndication is something that we're quite concerned by. It is very hard to tell. So we call it republication strategy or tactic. So sometimes you'll see, for example, that an entire article from RT will be reposted by in an outlet by someone else. So that's one specific case. A good example is the amount of reposted content between Iran and Venezuela, which you wouldn't really think that there is a connection, but there's actually quite a big connection. The struggle there, though, is, is this a coordinated effort between the two governments, or is this just something different? It's hard to tell. The second kind of republication that we have seen is just this specific use of very strange keywords. So China started using this term right before the U.S. election, which is it's basically, the translation is pre-election vaccine. Right. And that's they were trying to play on this notion that President Trump was trying to get a vaccine out in the market so that he could win his election, but that the vaccine itself is probably not very effective. And so that term popped up then, like, in a bunch of the other actors that we were tracking as well, that are definitely not U.S. allies. And so we flagged it and we said, hey, like we need to actually look at whether we're not, they're actually coordinating their efforts in terms of making sure that that content of some kind or some variation gets reposted constantly for the maximum number of eyeballs.
So I want to ask you slightly a different question, but I think it's kind of leading to all of this, which is that recently Google announced their Lambda capability, and it's been fairly kind of pronounced in the news. And it's this large language model, and it's this deep learning algorithm trained on enormous amounts of text data. And I wonder how, as that become fairly ubiquitous across clouds, API services, from text, visual to audio services, how should we be concerned about that? And how does that open up the risk of greater misinformation, disinformation, and just biasness in AI?
That's a great question. I still need to do my own homework on Lambda, but one of the things that we're really concerned about is always that training set biases, right? So what if the training set that they're using is biased in some way? What if it doesn't take certain dialects into consideration? And, what if Google decides, I only care about these 40 languages and I don't really care about the others? In that case, what do we do with the other ones? Do we just decide that they're no longer important? So we're only really focused on content in this language, which has its own problems when it comes to analysis and better understanding the cultural context and intelligence of the people who speak that language. But so that's certainly one way. And then the second way, and I'm not sure if this is a little bit too futuristic right now, but we're really concerned about the notion of data poisoning. So this is basically sort of like much more on the cybersecurity aspect of it, but someone going in, not hacking the entire system, but hacking a small part of it by changing the training data set or just the analysis itself without people realizing.
Yeah, I mean, I think for those that are listening, they may not make the connection in terms of why that could be, dangerous. But if you take a very kind of simple example of, let's say, you're training flights for autonomous flying vehicles, for example, and flight avoidance, let's say, a collision avoidance. Certainly, if you taint it to you, the point that you're providing, in certain kind of edge cases, you're going to have a higher increase in potential danger and risk of harm. And certainly, the thing with disinformation and the tainting of the data is that even though these are not material in terms of physical objects, it's affecting everything, right? In terms of our policies. Just recently, there's been some policies, legislation that's passed in DC. But even at the highest level of politics, we're starting to see them being influenced by disinformation. Again, in a very rational basis, right? Because they're just trying to get reelected or trying to increase their base, even though their base may be, kind of questionable in terms of what their belief systems are. For those that are listening, and I guess, and I've always been kind of very open and frank, which is I'm neither, this party or that party, but rather something that I think University of Chicago has done a really great job of asking is the why question, which is don't just assume just because it's been something that everybody believes in that it's the truth. So how do we as individuals begin to have our own independent thought and critical thinking abilities, regardless what we truly believe, again, whether that's rational or irrational?
I think the easiest thing to do is there are a couple of really great websites out there, but it's just to really just do a fact check or just do a quick Google search and see if there's anything that shows up that's like, debunking something. Misinformation, there's a difference between mis and disinformation because misinformation is the unintentional spread of rumors or fake stats or, just somebody simply made a mistake somewhere. Versus disinformation, which is very intentional. And so even to cut down on misinformation, I would say, before you decide to stake something 100% or even 50% on a couple of arguments, that you Google those arguments and make sure that there are at least 2 to 3 legitimate sources that back those statements or arguments.
I wish that individuals would actually take the effort to do that. But I think this is where your service could potentially come in. Again, I know you guys are focused more on the DoD side, but at some point from a commercialization, having some trusted rating around the trustworthiness of what we're reading or seeing will be helpful. Today I've been joined by Evanna Hugh, who is the CEO of Omelas and the non-resident fellow, senior fellow at the Atlantic Council. Thank you for joining today.
Thanks for having me.
If you've enjoyed this episode, take a moment to rate our show on any podcast platform that you listen to. Scroll down to the bottom and push 5 stars. It's that easy. And as always, thanks for listening.